And welcome back. We have made it to our final group of panelists. This one is called Teach Them Well, Medical Education Precisely. And I'm very excited to introduce our moderator today for this panel. It's Mike Gisandi, who is part of the Stanford Department of Emergency Medicine as our Vice Chair of Education. And I wanted to say two things that I always remember about Mike. When he first got here to Stanford, he described it, well, when he came back, he's been here and he left and he came back. He called it the land of milk and honey. And that phrase has always stuck with me. And so, yeah, Stanford's the, and I love that. The other thing, Mike Gisandi quote, is, as a physician now in the emergency department, I am no longer the library. I am no longer have to know everything. I am now the librarian. And that's also stuck with me too. And it reminds me every day how I have to be teaching my residents. I don't have to have every single answer for them down to the milligram per kilogram dose, but I have to help them find those answers and be able to lead them to the answers that they seek. So thank you, Mike, for that. And with that, I will let you introduce this fantastic panel we have and kick off a great discussion.
Thanks, Jason. I always fear when I'm getting quoted in public, so that was those two were acceptable. So thanks for not finding some of the other quotes. So we're here to talk about innovation in medical education, and specifically we're going to talk about precision medical education. And to do that, we have a really outstanding panel today, and I'll introduce each of them briefly. Dr. Holly Coretta-Wire is an assistant professor of emergency medicine and a senior investigator in the Precision Education and Assessment Research Lab, the PEARL, which makes her, I guess, an expert in precision education. She's also the competency-based medical education implementation lead at Stanford School of Medicine, and she's a doctoral student at Maastricht University in getting her PhD in medical education, one of the best international PhD programs for MedEd. She's a principal investigator on the AMA Reimagining Residency Grant Program, so thinking about innovation as we discuss graduate medical education, or GME. And her primary interest is systemic change to ensure continuum of medical education. That is her research interest. She's joined today by Dr. David Salzman. David is an associate professor in both the departments of emergency medicine and medical education at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine. He's a fellowship director for a medical education scholarship research fellowship, and his primary interest in research is simulation-based mastery learning. And our final panelist is Dr. Martin Cusick. He's an associate professor in both the departments of pediatrics and emergency medicine at Harvard Medical School. He too is part of the AMA Change Medical Education Consortium, again, an innovation group. And his research interest is primarily adaptive learning of visual diagnoses. So I'm excited that all three of our panelists are here today to discuss innovation in precision medical education. And I think the audience who's joined STEMX today knows a lot about precision health and precision medicine, but perhaps not precision education. So I think we have to start by defining the term precision medical education for our audience. It's a term I don't think most folks are really familiar with. So ladies first, Holly, can you help us understand what is precision medical education?
Sure. So, we've spent this whole day talking about precision medicine as an approach for disease treatment and prevention that really takes into account each individual's own variability, their genetics, their environment, their lifestyle, which allows, us as physicians and researchers to predict more accurately the treatment and prevention strategies that work for them. That's in contrast to this one-size-fits-all approach that we've always thought about. And I think education is very similar. So precision education assessment is really a comprehensive approach to teaching and learning that is data-informed, timely. You think about is tailored to each individual learner. It takes into account their individual data, their metrics, their context, their social constructs, so the things that are happening in their life, their individual goals, both around their learning clinically and their professional development. And it takes all of these different things and it personalizes their education to them as an individual. So curriculum, assessment, learning, and it turns into kind of this cycle where they plan to learn, they reflect, there's assessment of that learning that they use to reflect, and it kind of becomes this iterative process in which they continue to individually tailor their training directly to the things that they need, which is flexible given that their context will change, their life goals will change, and so the personalization of their learning will change with them.
And just to strike a difference, I think maybe some folks in the audience have heard about individualized learning plans. They're used, in primary and secondary school. So you're those on the panel with kids, your kids may have an ILP at their school. How is individualized learning different than precision education? Are those different terms? How are they integrated?
Right. So, precision education certainly includes individualized learning, the individualization of curricula and, the different components of learning. I think about precision education and assessment more as a very data-driven process. So we think about assessment as being, quote unquote, fit for purpose. So say I want to know about a specific outcome in each, for each of my trainees. I'm going to design an assessment that will target that specific outcome. I'm going to get that data, and the individual trainee will sit down and say, here's what I think of that data. They'll have a coach that tells them what they think of that data. And it drives all the decision-making on the back end. But they take that data, and in collaboration with that coach, they drive this individualized learning plan. It's very data-driven. And I think about precision education as being very focused on what does the data tell us? Is it telling us the right thing? Are there gaps? And what does that data tell us to do, going forward in how we address learning, how we design curricula, how we change up where they're rotating at the time. So I'll give you an example. So say I have a trainee that is an emergency medicine resident, and I'm looking at all of this data from the electronic health record, perhaps. And I'm seeing that, even if we control for the individual faculty they're working with and how busy the ED is, they just struggle intensely with team leadership. And maybe it's the communication in the room, maybe it's not, but we use the data from that to drive, assessing them and their team leadership skills and drilling down on what it is that they're struggling with. And then actually using that for simulation, assessment, future learning, to help them develop those skills.
All right. Martin, I'm going to turn to you next. We do a lot of work in this space, particularly around how data can be used for predictive purposes, for analytic purposes. What do you think about precision as it relates to the training of tomorrow's physician workforce?
Well, I think it's wonderful. I think it's just where we've naturally evolved to. This conference has talked about just how much data we can suck back from our clinical processes. Well, that can happen in learning as well. And so that our research is around visual diagnosis, in which we download as many x-rays or photos or electrocardiograms and the like as we can, and then have people do them. And so they do them, they diagnose them with feedback, and each person develops a learning curve. And in one of the earlier sessions, they talked about spaghetti plots. Well, when it comes to learning curves, everybody's learning curve is different. And so when you overlay them, some people zoom up, some people take forever, some people have a y-intercept here, some people have a y-intercept there. And so that there's tremendous inter-individual variability that we used to ignore. So that I'm going on Friday to do my PALS course. And so when I walk into the PALS course, it's going to be a standardized algorithm that's aimed at a standardized learner. And I've been doing pediatric emergency medicine for a lot of years. I would argue that I shouldn't have to do exactly the same PALS course as the other 20 people in the session. Well, if we can track the learning processes and we can track how good you are in the way Holly mentioned, then we can take your learning curve into account and gradually have you climb it in a way that's adapted to you. And so that part of the learning process becomes making sure that you take care of basic competence. But then part of the learning process is also about efficiency. And so that so if I can do it faster, then I'm out faster. But if I need more time, then I get more time, and everybody comes out at the very end at exactly the same level in terms of the way that they deal with whatever the standardized electrocardiogram or X-ray or whatever it is. And that's what matters to patients. that when we graduate from our learning experiences, that we all function at the same level, as opposed to the fact that we all spent 4 years in residency. So that's, I think, in that regard, precision medical education is just a natural outgrowth to us doing it better and better. And I would echo, Holly's plea for data-driven processes. And so wherever we can find data that informs the learning process, whether it's directly for the learner or for the people responsible for their learning, that has to be the way we go.
Okay, Dr. Salzman, you're hearing a lot of discussion about data and data usage, and that's really been a focus of all of the talks today. We talked about data and how to make the healthcare delivery more efficient because of it. And your work is about generating data, though, that we can use now. When you listen to Holly and Martin talk, they're talking about data usage in a future sense, but I don't think that you do as much future casting with your platforms. You have data that you can use right now. So how do you conceptualize and even prioritize the data that you use and collect at Northwestern?
So Mike, it's a complicated answer. And honestly, I think that could probably serve as the basis of an entire additional panel, all about data collection and assessment. So let me try and highlight a couple of key ideas as we think about this, primarily from the perspective of a curriculum designer or someone, as you said, Mike, who's using this data today. So I think the first big concept that we have to decide is specifically which components of topics we're going to assess, right? Holly alluded to this earlier, this idea of fit for purpose. And we have to identify data that's going to answer a question. And so the question is the question today, or is the question in the future? And it is answering what's today. And one of my mentors, Dr. Bill McGay, he often referred to this as thinking about an iceberg. There's a huge iceberg, but we can only see a part of it, and we have to make decisions about identifying which parts of that assessment we're going to do. And so my approach is that the data that we collect has to answer a question. We have to make choices. We can't assess everything at once, and we can't collect data about everything and use it today. It's just not feasible. And the second component of data and collection for using it right now is that the data that we collect has to be good data. It has to be objective, reliable, valid, and quite honestly, indisputable. If we're making these decisions about individualized learning plans or how much time in a PALS course, for example, as Martin alluded to, that you need, we have to make sure that data is good. Because if it isn't good, then all the decisions that we're making about has the learner met our standard, have they mastered this criteria, can they move on to the next level of training, will not be based on any good foundation. And the last part about data collection, and this is probably where I'm going to become a little bit of the pragmatist, is also, I think, prioritizing how we're going to collect the data, right? Like big data is here, and there's no doubt that it's going to play a huge role in medicine. And we can collect everything, but what are we going to use it for? And I think at least when we're making these decisions about today, answering these questions, what is it going to be used for? And at some point, we probably get enough information that we've saturated the outputs, right? That we get inputs from peers and other collaborators in the healthcare environment. And at some point, we've reached the information that we need, and so no further. So I guess as it becomes easier and easier and easier to store data, we have to make sure that that data is still answering the question as to what is our problem today or tomorrow, but how can we use that data to advance our overall goals of education?
Okay, great. And I always respected you for being the pragmatist. So that you're the pragmatist. Maybe Holly and Martin are as well, but you were my pragmatic invitation to today's panel. So all right. So for the audience, right, we're talking about innovation and precision medical education. We had to define first precision, and I think what I'm hearing from our panelists, is that we have this concept of big data in medical education. We can harness and collect data in a lot of different ways. Maybe our panelists necessarily, David at the very end did necessarily tell us where the data input comes from, right? Like I'm a resident or I'm a medical student. I'm not just getting test scores. There's lots of people looking at me in all different ways, 360-degree evaluations. There's things that I'm interacting with on a computer, right? Typing in an electronic health record. The EHR can be harnessed to get educational data based on what the student is typing if you build your AI in that manner. So lots of data collection, and using that data either to make a decision, a high-risk decision, right, to graduate a physician and move them on in practice, or to hold them back. These are high-risk decisions based upon a lot of data around us. And as David points out, once you've made the decision, move on, right? As Martin pointed out, once they know how to read an EKG, they know how to read an EKG, move on, right? These are important usages of our data. So now that that's defined, precision is defined, let's move to the innovation part, right? So Holly, let's get granular. So I'll let you know, if David's our pragmatist, he'll be our granular panelist. What do you think about innovation in the traditional medical education historical sense, and what do you think innovation should look like broadly as we apply precision medical education concepts?
Yeah, certainly. And I'm going to kind of bring it back to something you just said. So, I mean, we think about innovation in medical education in a very traditional change management sense, right? You have faculty, you have learners, you have stakeholders. You look at the global perspective, you try to bring in everyone's opinion and, try and get like a team together to do the things and get everyone going in the right direction. Change occurs over time. It's subsequently evaluated. It's kind of a very, you identify the problem, you do the things. I kind of want to zoom out and think about this in more of a design-based thinking sense, where you're trying to deeply understand the problem that's faced by your end users. So in this instance, it's each individual trainer. And you're doing this on an individual level. You're trying to understand their situation, their context, all of their different goals, identify what it is that they are after, and what, the thing is that they need to accomplish next, and co-create. So co-ideate solutions, co-prototype, and then use this reflection process, this, in kind of the sense of, in the business literature, you talk about the flywheel. It's almost like a flywheel where you think about, what is it that, we planned, we did, let's evaluate it, let's reflect on it, and use this rapid cycle evaluation process to iterate on what we're doing. Maybe it's that the problem changed a little bit. Maybe it's that our approach wasn't quite right. You go back and you iterate each individual round such that you're improving, or you're changing your focus just a little bit because, maybe you improved on something and now you've uncovered another thing that you need to work on. It's this iterative process. And I think about this in talking with, folks who use this big data in medical education. It's like moneyballing our trainees in this process, right? So you think about, StatCast AI for baseball, where, you look at how far the runner is off of first base, who the catcher is, and their arm speed and accuracy, and, how, what the foot speed is of the person who's on first, the likelihood that they're going to steal that base. And trying to use those kinds of metrics, we say we have these 360-degree evaluations of our trainees. Yeah, we're not necessarily just looking at test scores. We're looking at, in the moment assessments in the clinical environment from multiple different perspectives in multiple different contexts with all of these different interdependent influences. How does all of that go into, what's going to happen next? And how does that inform our innovative kind of design-based process for each individual trainee? And then I think we also need to consider, obviously, the system. But I think, it gets into the weeds about what is it that each individual trainee needs based on all these different data pieces.
So this was the conference about innovation. So is innovation then the tech that allows us to collect all this data and analyze it in some fashion? Or as you said, the design, right? Is the innovation really the pedagogy that we have to follow in medical education? And the data is just, sort of a necessary evil that comes along with us as we try to design the right system for the right student in the right workplace.
Yeah, I think this gets to everything that we're talking about. Both Martin and David also alluded to this idea of assessment fit for purpose. It's both. And I think it's the pedagogy and the design and the system and the learning environment. It's the actual design and the data it facilitates us collecting, right? Because we're trying to get the right data to go with the system that we're living in and each of these trainees are operating in. And I think without the design, you're not going to get the right data, and then the right data is not going to make the right change.
Okay.
Can I add to that, Mike? I love the iceberg analogy, but in a digitalized world, we can have the whole iceberg. And so that we need to be intentional about which parts of it we choose. But for example, in one project, and I'll put it in the chat box, we downloaded 5 years worth of ECGs from our Department of Emergency Medicine. And so that's 80,000 ECGs. And we know from research that my ability to pick the best teaching ECG out of that pile is okay, but only okay. And there's a fat tail in terms of the cases within that pile that may be useful and may be fit for some purpose that I don't know right now. And so that this conference has been about using these large amounts of data in ways that we haven't yet imagined. And that's kind of, hard for us as educators to think in a complementary fashion along those lines. We're used to tightly controlling curricula. We're used to putting them in learning management systems that are 100 miles away from the electronic patient record, and sort of controlling our environment and then making a high stakes decision as to whether or not you graduate from medical school or residency. But I think that one of the exciting areas that we're going to move into is education that gets, as you say, precise, but precise in a way that ends up being about micro certifications and little pieces of specialized knowledge that won't be centrally managed, but will instead be kind of particular to certain contexts, and that fit between digital context, person, AI. It's going to become quite a complex soup, and I think that we would do well to be greedy about the learning process data that we collect, even if we don't know yet how it's going to be used.
David, what about your future casting? Where do you see the innovation space maturing in medical education?
All this big data is making me think even bigger right now. So again, the pragmatist is going to come back into the house for a moment. I think, so for me, and again, it's been alluded to, and just to make it more explicit, I think one of the biggest places for innovation is going to be time. So time-based medical education, and we're starting to see glimpses of this. There's been clearly a migration towards competency-based education is clearly a thing that exists across all domains of medical education. It's happening at the student level with the entrustable professional activities, in the GME level with the milestones and the competencies. There's great evidence in the pediatric world with the EPAC trial, so the education across the pediatric continuum, identifying that we can reliably identify learners who can advance to the next stage of training without having to go through the full time-based component, right? Martin's example from PALS, right? Why, if he's been doing this for 20 years, I think is what you said, why do you need to go through the entire certification process when you do this on a regular basis? And you could probably have a very short refresher where you go in, demonstrate competency, and then go on to make more spaghetti curves or do things that are far more important to advance medical education and things that we're doing right now. And so I think that this innovation space, in addition to all the data that we're going to need to collect to be able to make these determinations about when can people move to that next level, I think is really going to start to be to think in that context of time, no longer being time-based, but rather being competency-based. And I think it's going to be medical student at the GME level, potentially even at the CME level, of completely changing the way that we think of maintenance of certification potentially, and how we do that. And to get there, I think there's a big cultural shift that has to happen around tests, right? That for many of us growing up and evolving in medicine, tests were a weapon that were used to hold us back or to demonstrate what we didn't know. And I think we have to move beyond this idea of evaluation or assessment, and that assessments are for growth and that they will help the learners progress to that next stage. And that's another big innovation that has to happen. Again, Holly's example earlier with the data to guide individualized learning plans with a coach to help bring people to that higher level, as opposed to holding people back, is where I'm hopeful and optimistic that this innovation can take us.
Yeah, so I'm hearing you talk about time-based medical education as the innovation space. And, I listened to really inspirational panels all day long today about changing healthcare systems. And I think about changing the medical education system. And you said, well, it will change. And I think, oh my gosh, it just can't change, right? That academic medical centers across the United States are built off the backs of house staff who are paid very little money and who are working according to a 12-month academic year cycle determined by Medicare funding. So if everyone here on the panel turned to their chairs and said, well, half of our residents are ready to graduate tomorrow, so I'm just going to pull them off the schedule because they're done. I've assessed them. They're completely competent. They can leave now. And what would happen to our healthcare delivery system? It would crumble because our hospitals are unable to keep themselves afloat without residents. They simply are. And they're cheap labor, and they're the cheap labor that keep the lights on. So now we're gonna switch up that model, right? And as you said, assessment for learning, we're gonna do all these really formative things along the way that kind of get them to the endpoint quicker because we've changed what the endpoint really should be. It shouldn't be a test. It shouldn't be 12 months. It could be 10 months, right? If you put that level of variability in the system falls apart. So, as we redesign all of these parts of the healthcare system, we have to redesign how we think about the use of trainees to keep the lights on, because I think that's going to be a big challenge as we move forward. So, Martin, I'm going to ask you the final question, and it's the $1 million question, and it's about tech, right? And how do we build the tech that we need for learning analytics? How does it integrate with our current healthcare system and our medical education system? You might have to define learning analytics, but this is what all of us, Silicon Valley, we're hosting it here. We want to know, how can we build the tech that's useful, and what tech should that look like?
Yeah. To start with the learning analytics, you've got clinical analytics, you've got business analytics, it's learning analytics, it's process data, and just increased density of process data around learning. So it's there's no mystery there. And I show this Venn diagram with a confluence of computer science and statistics and learning sciences, and to say that the learning sciences influence learning analytics, and that's the sweet spot there. I think, Mike, that we need both breadth and depth approaches, and so that so we need, if you had $100 million or $200 million, you might want to spend $100 million of it on a fantastic EAR, electronic arts level game showing emergency medicine resuscitation, and then scale that to the planet. And they spend you spend $100 million on a standard game. Well, why haven't we done that for something as important as the resuscitation of a human? And then you might take the second $100 million and fracture it into 100 projects. $1 million here, $1 million there, sort of across, trying to figure out and probe and find the sweet spots, and fail a whole bunch of times. But in the way that we've heard described, the AI, not free for all, but the every nook and cranny is being explored right now to see whether or not AI works. Well, how about the nooks and crannies in the way people learn, and so that we can exploit human capital to the absolute maximum, and sort of not just in the sense of performance on an exam, but in a sense of humans plus AI joining together to create some new, even better way of doing each and everything. And so that there are going to be all sorts of dislocations, and we have to learn from the Facebook example of you can't just build the tech and then do it on a dollars per click basis and have that be the endpoint. There's going to be a humanity price to pay somewhere along the lines. And so that so I would look to Silicon Valley for imagination, but at the same time look for that we're smarter now. We're more mature about this. We can, get the anthropologists and the ethicists and the laggards on the Rogers innovation curve and have them be part of this as we move it forward. And nothing says this has to be built tomorrow. And so that it's going to take time to switch over the residency programs and change the way CMS reimburses hospitals and the whole bit. So be it. And so that we're doing this for our grandchildren, and so that so it doesn't have to be done by Q3 of 2022. And so that leave aside the whole DEI implications of everything that's going on. And so I think I would end on that we have to make the investments, we have to put in the effort, but we have to, kind of take our time and be thoughtful about it. And conferences like this are a fantastic place to surface this, but also to take some time to reflect and to really go home and do our projects in the most thoughtful way possible.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. I think one of your earliest points in that response really struck with me, which is the idea that you could take $100 million and give it to one company, and or you could take $1 million and give it to 100 companies and see what grows, right? And I think that's the beauty of all three of our institutions on this panel today, that they invest broadly in junior faculty, assuming that somebody's going to get the Nobel, right? And similarly, Silicon Valley, I literally live on Sand Hill Road here with all of the investors, right? They're just investing in people all up and down Sand Hill. Somebody's going to open Facebook. And I think when we think about innovation in this medical education space, I think of it as an institution by institution, living example of those analogies, right? So at some point, accreditation cycles and expectations for certifications are going to be so unwieldy, if we're not already there, that the Stanfords or the Harvards or the Northwesterns are going to say, I'm done. I don't need your accreditation anymore. I can train people just fine without ACGME accreditation. Come here. We'll truly innovate. We'll truly get you out the road, right? The reason that we don't do that is because all of our hospitals are functioning off the backs of house staff who are federally funded, right? And if we could find a way to teach them without that federal dollars, and we wouldn't need the accreditation anymore, right? We wouldn't need any of that anymore. And we could begin to truly innovate. And I think if we looked at the 100 different, medical centers that are each investing their own dollars in their own budgets, somebody's got to be able to be that one that stands out. I mean, I remember when Harvard stopped taking the SAT, right? The whole country just about, shut down. And what do we do with the SAT? Why do we have this number, right? Similarly, any of us could come out of the accreditation game, and I think we would be winners for doing so. It just takes a little bit of bold innovation, if you will, to make that happen. So I think we're about time for some audience questions, if I'm looking at my clock correctly, and maybe we have a moment or two for those.
I was going to let
And Jason, great, on cue. Jason shows up to help me with that. Great, Jason. What questions do we have from the audience?
Well, I like this one because it's a little Black Mirror Orwellian. If tomorrow's medical education is all data driven, will this be used to determine what my future career opportunities should be or allowed to be? If you're getting tested all the time on your abilities, are you going to be shuttled into a specific role?
I'm going to let Martin take this one because this actually is sort of the case in other countries.
Yeah, I make a difference between training and education. Training being I know exactly what I want to produce and I know all the steps leading to there. So my PALS example would be training. And so that's going to be completely data driven and should be the same way some well mapped out clinical process should be, and as well. And so your numbers, Holly's Moneyball example, will be exactly kind of what needs to be done. But education is different. you know, sort of why do you have a liberal arts college when, you know, kind of it has no demonstrable numberable benefit to anybody that they can show as a father who's paying such tuitions. And so that the idea there is to prepare you for 10 years, 20 years down the line as to how to think. And that's going to be art. That's going to be non-money from money viable, inventing words. And so that part of it, you're going to be able to make a case that you're special. And so that and the degree to which you can make that case in those sorts of more ephemeral, more human ways, and that might be the way you use AI. I don't know, but there will be think of those two different poles, and then think about how you're going to make your case for whatever it is based on that.
You know, I'm curious, David or Holly, what you think of that answer and the question. Aren't we already doing this, right? So Holly said we're doing this in other countries, right? In England, you just take the test as many times as you do until you get to be the doctor, right? Or you get to move on. But we do this already with just different numbers, right? We do this with to some degree test scores, to some degree the ranking of our medical schools, right? Like once you get into Harvard and Stanford and Northwestern, right? You're in the top 20 medical schools right there. Your career is pretty much determined, right? Whether you have any other numbers attached to you, as long as you do well in those circumstances, you probably can continue to live at the top 20 medical schools. So we define our futures by all sorts of numbers, and I think we don't look at them maybe as test scores every time. What do you guys think?
I think this makes such an interesting point. So this gets to some of my work in the domain of selection. I think, you know, I agree with you in that the test scores, the rankings, all of these things in and of this moment certainly do seem to predict, you know, your life as it is laid out for you, you know, your maximum potential or what you're allowed to be. But I also think that a lot of things we're talking about right now are trying to get us away from that. So to Martin's point about maybe you get a liberal arts degree, that gives you insight, perspective, things that perhaps someone who, you know, only focused on, you know, these numbers, what you're allowed to be, the current things that dictate your life, wouldn't necessarily have. So if we're changing the way we think about this, you know, we're saying that a lot of the metrics we currently use are garbage. They don't predict future performance. They're not useful in our Moneyball scheme. We're changing the metrics that we use to perhaps capture things like insight, discernment, clinical reasoning, you know, resilience, all of these other things that perhaps we care about so much more, then I actually think that perhaps the direction we're heading is really in the opposite direction of, you know, where we currently are, and the fact that some of these very finite measures dictate what you're allowed to be.
Yeah, David will remember when we did selection at Northwestern together as a team, I would take a NCAA athlete who had a B average 100 times over the pedigree A plus average from one of our schools, whose work ethic is just simply not going to be the same as that NCAA Division I athlete. I totally agree.
Can I just add something? And that may be the distinction between is the data going to be used to determine what your career could be, or maybe what it should be? Because I think, not saying that people need to be pigeonholed into a specific career, and definitely not limited from a future career, as we know that many of our assessments right now are embedded in inequity. So if there's a way that these assessments can be more equitable, can be fairer, may help provide the students much better insight into perhaps what should I go into, right? That maybe in this domain, whatever that domain is, my performance is not that great. And despite all the attempts that I have to try and get better and better and better, I'm much better in this domain. And all the data is saying I'm much better here. Then with some good advising, we can help people make those selections to careers that will hopefully provide them fulfillment as well, as opposed to pigeonholing into something.
It's like all those quizzes in Tiger Beat when you were in high school, David. You took your quiz and it told you who you should marry in life, right? I think it's the exact same analogy.
Do people know what Tiger Beat is anymore, Mark? Like, I don't know.
Yeah. Hey, I see a question about patient involvement. I think this is a really interesting one. So where do the patients fit in these medical education models, and how we build for the future? Where do patients, play a part? Let's do David. David, why don't you start there?
I think there's certain domains in which patients can play a huge role, and their insight and input is incredibly important. This comes to mind. We just did a study and published about it about at the time of discharge in emergency medicine, having to convey uncertainty to patients at the time of discharge. And a big component of the development of the checklist to get this data was driven by a panel of patients, because those are the ones who need to hear this information and do they understand it. And it's not just what do we think as physician educators, but what's important to patients also. And it's one specific example, but I do think in the domains that patients are able to assess, communication, even observation of teamwork, depending on specialties, we need to get that data, because that's how we will be assessed on that, and physicians and healthcare providers, we interface with the patient, and so not involving patients, I think, is a blind spot.
I do want to get to our final question for the panel, but Holly or Martin, if you have a comment about where patients fit in, please jump in.
I mean, I think it gets back to this idea of this design-based approach, right? They are certainly a stakeholder. They are the ultimate, right? And I think each individual trainee's path leads to taking care of society. So patients should certainly have an impact on the decisions that we make at every phase of training, of development, all of these different things. I mean, that's why, so for the emergency medicine EPA, so the framework that we're building, we've had patient input on those.
Question, I think, is very much STEMi. This is a great way to end the day. And I'm going to ask the question, there's two parts. I'll ask it in reverse. So is emergency medicine residency training going to be one big simulation, right? So the question includes, how does VR and AI and data affect the future of medical education? I think those are three very, very different things that we're kind of throwing together in a STEMi way. But Martin, what do you think about this? So is residency just going to be a big simulation?
To a certain degree, yes, and good. The flipped classroom is an example of stuff you can do on your own now, and then use the human and the generalizable field better, so that we don't use classrooms for delivering didactic material anymore. We use the instructors to develop nuanced, gray, humanistic, shadings of the material. You can imagine a scenario, in our radiology work. I dream of a time when radiology residency will be, the first year will be you in front of a computer. And I'll drop in front of you exactly the X-ray that you need to see next in order to get better in the most efficient way possible. And I'll have Holly's Moneyball statistics to the nth degree, and I'll know exactly when you're ready. So I think it's crazy that we use the clinical environment to, on a haphazard basis, show you the spectrum of illness for, whatever the study is. So I think that simulation will be used to systematize and give us a better sense of who you are. And then when we get to the border cases of that simulation, that's when we hand you over to real life, and we have you, and we focus on you generalizing those skills to the context where they're going to be needed.
David, Holly?
I mean, I'm a simulationist. I love simulation.
I'm getting to that.
So I guess I should jump on this question. I like this idea, Martin, that you bring up of the beginning part being simulation based. However, the one little area that I'm going to push back, and like I said, I do simulation all the time, is that we're not training people to take care of simulators. We're training physicians to take care of people in much the same way that pilots practice on a simulator, but eventually have to fly an airplane. And so I think that maybe residency, a portion of it will continue to be increased simulation, but at the end of the day, there's a lot more than just the algorithms. It's reading people's faces, and maybe AI and VR is going to get a lot better that we'll be able to do that and the nuance. But to be able to see and learn some of that nuance in a mentored way in the clinical environment, I think is going to remain an essential part of clinical training.
That's a really great point to end on, David, and I'm really grateful to you and Holly and Martin for being on this panel. We're talking about medical education and training the future of the physician workforce. Once we've trained them, then they're out, and then they get to practice, right? And I think that I think that we can use data in all these different ways to be able to be assured that those physicians are ready to practice. But I don't know that we need to perseverate about simulated data, for instance. We can watch them in practice and collect data on them as they take care of patients. It's not all about just the preparation to become a physician, but watching them after they become independent. So thanks for all of our panelists. I'll turn it back over to Jason.
I was just going to say, I think some of the areas that we study lend themselves more to simulation type of training, and then others, those nuances that David was talking about, those human interactions, those subtleties, you have to see a patient to really get a feel for. So I think it's probably going to be a blended picture of both. Holly, did you have anything to wrap us up or to say as we close out here?
I mean, I think that's what this conference is all about. It's this idea of human-centered AI, innovation, and how we make this come together and work in a way that meets the needs of, our patients, our trainees, the future of society.
Well put.